On December 11th, 1936, the unimaginable happened. Edward VIII, King of the United Kingdom and Emperor of India, gave up the throne for a commoner's love. The man who had it all, the throne, the power, the admiration, woke up one day and said, "I'd rather be in love than rule an empire." Now, I know what you're thinking. Who does that, right? Well, this wasn't just any love story. It was one for the ages, packed with scandals, drama, and a woman who was nothing like a traditional queen, Wallis Simpson. So who was this Wallis Simpson? Why was she worth giving up the fricking crown for? Well, to understand that, we need to rewind a bit and take a closer look at Edward VIII and the woman who stole his heart. To truly understand why Edward VIII was so willing to give up the throne for Wallis Simpson, we have to go back and look at who Edward was before he ever met her. Born in 1894 as the eldest son of King George V and Queen Mary, Edward was thrust into the limelight from the moment he was born. The future of the British Empire was riding on his shoulders, and everyone had expectations for him. But here's the thing about Edward. He was nothing like his dad. While King George V was all about tradition, duty, and that stiff upper lip vibe you'd expect from British royalty, Edward was cut from a totally different cloth. Edward was a natural charmer from the get-go. He had this magnetic personality that made him a crowd favourite, especially during the First World War, when he served with the Grenadier Guards. He was out there on the front lines, lifting spirits and winning people over with his down-to-earth attitude and good looks. But behind all the smiles and charm, Edward was a restless guy, not exactly excited about a life tied down by royal responsibilities. Edward's education was all about gearing him up for kingship, but hitting the books wasn't exactly his thing. He was way more into socializing, sports, and living the high life than diving into the details of governance. His tutors had a tough time keeping him on track, and while he wasn't exactly dumb, it was pretty clear that Edward preferred having fun over preparing for a future filled with royal duties. This restless energy carried over into his adult life. As the Prince of Wales, he was supposed to be the poster boy for the British monarchy. Think stability, tradition, and respectability. But instead, Edward earned a reputation as a bit of a playboy, which definitely worried his parents and advisors. He loved to party, and he had a string of romantic flings that kept the gossip mills busy. The British press knew all about Edward's escapades, but kept it under wraps. After all, he was the future king. But Edward's hesitation to take on his royal duties wasn't just him being rebellious. Deep down, he wasn't sure about the whole idea of the monarchy. He started to wonder if it really mattered in the modern world and got more and more frustrated with the strict rules and expectations that came with being the future king. As he got older, these doubts only grew, making him an heir who would rather live life his own way than get ready for the throne. So, when his father, King George V, died in January 1936, Edward was still in his 40s and still not ready to be king. But ready or not, the crown was his. And then, Wallis Simpson showed up and turned everything upside down. Wallis Warfield Simpson was no stranger to drama even before she'd met Edward. Born in 1896 in Pennsylvania, Wallis was always ambitious. Her father died shortly after she was born, leaving her mother to struggle with keeping up appearances despite their money troubles. Wallis quickly learned that in a world where wealth and status ruled, charm and wit could be just as powerful as money. Her first marriage to US Navy pilot Earl Winfield Spencer Jr. was rocky from the start. Win, as he was called, was an alcoholic with a temper, and Wallis soon found herself stuck in a miserable marriage. She eventually left him, and they divorced in 1927, but Wallis wasn't one to dwell on the past. She moved to London, ready for a fresh start and determined to make a name for herself in British high society. It wasn't long before she married her second husband, Ernest Aldrich Simpson, a British-American shipping broker. On the surface, This marriage seemed more stable. Wallis quickly became a regular in London's social circles, known for her sharp wit, flawless style, and ability to navigate high society with ease. She was glamorous, sophisticated, and had a mysterious air that fascinated everyone. But behind her polished exterior, Wallis was still searching for something more. Ernest was successful, but not wealthy enough to match Wallis's ambitions, and while she enjoyed the perks of her life in London, it always felt like she was waiting for something or someone to truly shake things up. And that's where our lovely prince comes in. Wallis and Edward met in the early 1930s through mutual friends. At first, their relationship was purely friendly, with Wallis and her husband hanging out in Edward's social circle. But it didn't take long for the sparks to fly. Edward was drawn to Wallis's intelligence, her boldness, and the way she treated him like a regular guy, not the future king of England. For someone who had spent his entire life surrounded by people telling him what he wanted to hear, Wallis was a breath of fresh air. Wallis, on the other hand, was captivated by Edward's charm and vulnerability. Wallis wasn't like other women, and she quickly realized that Edward wasn't like other men. Their relationship got pretty serious quickly, and bonds strengthened. But there was one huge problem. Wallis was still married to Ernest Simpson, and in the conservative, tradition-bound world of British monarchy, a relationship between the heir to the throne and a married woman wasn't just scandalous. It was an unthinkable abomination. As time went on, it became pretty clear to anyone paying attention that Edward and Wallis were more than just friends. They traveled together, dined together, and were spotted at all the right places. Before long, the whispers of scandal started making the rounds. For Edward, this wasn't just a casual fling. He was in love and dead set on marrying Wallis, even if it meant defying his family, the government, and the church. Wallis too was drawn to the idea of being with Edward, though she knew the road ahead would be rocky. But while Edward was ready to throw caution to the wind, Wallis was more realistic. She knew their relationship was risky, to say the least. Not only was she married, but the idea of a twice-divorced American woman becoming Queen of England was unthinkable to many. Wallis herself had doubts. She wasn't sure if Edward could actually go through with it, whether he would really choose her over the throne. Meanwhile, the British government was getting seriously worried. Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin was especially concerned about the chaos that could unfold if Edward followed through with his plan to marry Wallis. With tensions rising in Europe and Hitler's power growing, the last thing Britain needed was a royal scandal that could destabilize the monarchy. The Church of England, where the king was the supreme governor, was also firmly against the idea. The church didn't recognize divorce, and the thought of the king marrying a twice-divorced woman was seen as completely unacceptable, both morally and religiously. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Cosmo Gordon Lang, made it clear that the church could never support such a marriage. For Wallis, the pressure was overwhelming. She suddenly found herself at the center of a storm that was spinning out of control. The British press, which had mostly kept quiet about Edward's private life, started dropping hints about the scandal brewing behind palace doors. Wallis became the target of intense media scrutiny, painted as the cunning manipulator who had trapped the king in her web. The whole situation was more complicated, but the public didn't care. They were absolutely hostile towards her. As the situation hit a breaking point, Wallis decided to take action. She fled to France, trying to distance herself from the chaos in London. She even offered to walk away from Edward, thinking it was the only way to save him and the monarchy from a full-blown crisis. But Edward wouldn't hear of it. He was determined to marry Wallis no matter the consequences. By late 1936, the situation had reached a breaking point. Edward was dead set on marrying Wallis, and the British government were just as determined to prevent it. Prime Minister Baldwin laid it out plainly. Edward had three options: end his relationship with Wallis, marry her and trigger a constitutional crisis, or forfeit the throne? For Edward, the choice was clear. On December 10th, 1936, he signed the Instrument of Abdication at Fort Belvedere, a royal residence in Surrey. The document was signed in the presence of his three younger brothers, Albert, who would become King George VI, Henry, Duke of Gloucester, and George, Duke of Kent. The next day, Edward went public with his decision in a radio broadcast to the nation. In his now famous speech, Edward explained his choice with striking honesty. "I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do without the help and support of the woman I love." The world was stunned. For the first time in history, a British monarchy had willingly given up the throne, not for politics, but for love. The abdication sent shockwaves through the British Empire, and its impact was felt for years. Edward's abdication was a major turning point for the British monarchy. His younger brother Albert, who became King George VI, wasn't exactly eager to take the throne. He had never planned on being king and was really nervous about whether he could do the job. But with the support of his wife, Elizabeth, who later became the Queen Mother, and his strong sense of duty, George VI stepped up. He led Britain through the tough times of World War II and helped restore the nation's failing trust in the monarchy. After the abdication, Edward became the Duke of Windsor and Wallis became the Duchess. But their life after all that drama wasn't exactly the fairy tale you might expect. They got married on June 3rd, 1937, in a small ceremony at the Chateau d'Ucande in France. It was a simple wedding with just a few close friends, no British royals in sight. This wasn't just a cold shoulder. It showed just how much Edward's choice had strained his relationship with his family. The Duke and Duchess spent most of their time living in exile, hopping around Europe and the US. They were seen as a glamorous couple, showing up at fancy parties and social events, but their life together wasn't perfect. Wallis, who had been trashed by the British press and shut out by the royal family, often felt lonely and unhappy. She never really fit into British high society, and their constant moving from one glamorous spot to another felt more like they were searching for something they could never really find. Still, Edward and Wallis stuck together. They lived a pretty comfortable life thanks to Edward's fortune and a government allowance, but they were always on the outside of the royal world that Edward had once been meant to lead. As they got older, they settled into a quieter life in Paris, hosting dinner parties and mingling with the social elite. But the shadow of abdication and the sacrifices they made for each other never really went away. Edward's health started to decline in the 1960s, and he passed away on May 28, 1972, at the age of 77, with Wallis by his side until the end. After Edward's death, Wallis's health quickly worsened. She lived another 14 years, but her final years were marked by loneliness and poor health. She passed away on April 24, 1986, at the age of 89. Wallis was buried next to Edward in the Royal Burial Ground at Frogmore, Windsor, a final gesture of acceptance from the royal family, though it came many years too late. In the end, Edward VIII and Wallis Simpson chose love over duty, breaking all of the rules and changing history, showing that love doesn't always follow the rules. Now here's the million-dollar question. Was it all worth it? Did Edward make the right call for giving up the throne for love? Or did he swap one kind of prison for another, trading the royal spotlight for a life of exile? Let us know what you think in the comments section below, and don't forget to like and subscribe to this channel for more amazing stories. See you next time.